Chapter 8. Our Brains, Our Biases, Our Systems. In 2015, I interviewed a man named Shaka Senghor for my show Super Soul Sunday. At the age of 19, Shaka had been convicted of second-degree murder. He served 19 years in prison, including a total of 7 years in solitary confinement. At the beginning of his sentence, Shaka was angry and violent, and quickly sank into a system that had no interest in preparing him for his eventual return to the outside world. But after 6 years behind bars, something shifted, and Shaka began to transform. In his 5x7 cell, he started meditating, reading, journaling, and writing what would eventually become his best-selling memoir, Righting My Wrongs. When I first saw a photo of Shaka on the cover of his book, I was skeptical. What could this tattooed, dreadlocked, convicted killer teach me? I thought. Our conversation was one of the best I've ever experienced. As his story unfolded over the course of our 2.5 hours together, so did my understanding of what it means to fall short, what it means to go astray, what it truly means to be shaped by your environment. Shaka, born James White, grew up in a middle-class family in Detroit. His father, a member of the Air Force Reserves, worked for the state of Michigan. His mother stayed at home with James and his 5 siblings. As a young boy, James was a straight-A student with dreams of becoming a doctor. From the outside, the Whites looked like the ideal American family, but Shaka says, for as long as he can remember, his mother had an explosive temper and took out her rage on her children. So, let me ask you this. Did you feel loved growing up?
I didn't feel like I was told, I do this because I love you, but it was always a whooping or a punishment.
Yeah. Shaka, I grew up like that too, where, if I were asked that question, I would say no, I didn't feel love growing up. Shaka recalled coming home from school one day when he was 9 years old, thrilled to have gotten an A+ on a test and hoping his mother would share his joy. Instead, she threw a pot at him so furiously it cracked the tiles on the kitchen wall behind him. I asked if he ever found out what she was upset about. I never knew, he said. My mother was upset often. As I listened, my heart broke for Shaka and the millions of people who, as children, regularly experienced paralyzing fear at home. The tragedy isn't just what that fear felt like in the moment. It's that they learned to bury the emotion and accept the behavior. In addition to his mother's physical abuse, Shaka says the last 5 years of his parents' marriage were unstable. He was devastated by their separations and rejoiced at their reunions, gutted and lifted, each time the cycle repeated. When they finally divorced, Shaka, tired of being betrayed by the people he loved most, says he built an emotional wall and sought protection and acceptance from the streets. He began acting out, getting in fights, refusing to do schoolwork, running away from home. What struck me most about Shaka's story is that at no time during this change from straight-A student to street kid did anyone ask, "What happened to you? Why are you behaving this way?" Not one adult seemed to notice or care that this young boy had completely lost his way. By age 14, Shaka was selling drugs, breaking into houses and shoplifting. After being shot at 17, he began carrying a gun with him at all times. He was in a culture and environment that perpetuated the idea that a young man's worth was defined by having money, attention, and a reputation as the bad guy.
Because in that space, I felt accepted. So leaving home, and I was around other broken, fragile young males, that we banded together around our brokenness. And we just this is support. This is love. This is I got your back no matter what.
But weren't you the smart one who wanted to be a doctor, I asked? Why did you want to be a doctor? He paused for 23 seconds, an eternity in TV time. I could tell he'd never really thought about this before.
That's all I've ever wanted to do, like growing up. Like that was, and I think back to, like, why was that what I wanted to do? And I realized that I like nice people. And the doctor was always nice to me. And even when my mother would take me to the doctor, she was nice. And like, I'm like, if I'm a doctor, and she'll be nice. And and so that, wow.
You just had an aha there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
It was a deeply moving moment of realization for both of us. A young man, confused and rejected by those who were charged with raising him, simply seeking his mother's validation and love. When he was 19, Shaka's dangerous life choices came to a head. One night, on his way home from a party, he started arguing with a man named David. In the middle of the fight, Shaka grabbed his gun and pulled the trigger and shot David, dead. In prison, Shaka found an environment he was familiar with, one where violence and domination reigned. He repeatedly landed himself in solitary confinement for everything from assaulting prison guards to trying to escape. What finally broke him open was a letter from his son. "Dear Dad," the letter read, "my mother told me you was in prison for murder. Dear Dad, don't murder anymore. Jesus watches what you do. Pray to him, and he'll forgive your sins."
That was the awakening.
Your born again moment.
Yeah. That was the moment when I decided that I would never go back to the darkness, and that I had to find my light, and that I owed it to him to find my light.
Since Shaka's release from prison in 2010, he's been a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform. He speaks to young people across the country, sharing his story and encouraging young men to avoid life on the streets. He's taught classes at the University of Michigan and is a fellow of the MIT Media Lab. At the heart of his work is the belief that people should not be defined by their past mistakes and that redemption is possible. Most people who are in the process of excavating the reasons they do what they do are met at some point with resistance. You're blaming the past. Your past is not an excuse. This is true. Your past is not an excuse, but it is an explanation, offering insight into the questions so many of us ask ourselves. Why do I behave the way I behave? Why do I feel the way I do? For me, there is no doubt that our strengths, vulnerabilities, and unique responses are an expression of what happened to us. Very often, what happened takes years to reveal itself. It takes courage to confront our actions, peel back the layers of trauma in our lives, and expose the raw truth of our past. But this is where healing begins. Oprah. When we first started talking about trauma over 30 years ago, not many people were aware of its impact on so many aspects of life. Have things changed? When you look at schools, the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, really everywhere you look, there are people impacted by trauma who are still misunderstood and sometimes re-traumatized by the very systems that should be helping them.
That is the heartbreaking truth. It takes a long time to change people and even longer to change systems. I am optimistic, though. Many positive changes are underway. Many more people are aware of how pervasive trauma is. More people understand that trauma can influence our health. But we do have a long way to go. We need more professionals and organizations to change the way they do business to help address the impact of trauma.
You're talking about trauma-informed care.
Yes and no. As you know, I'm not a fan of that term. I'm impressed by what is happening in many places attempting to implement trauma-informed care, but I think the language is getting in the way of progress. Let me explain why. As we've been discussing, the complexities of trauma impact all of our systems, from maternal child health to child welfare to education, law enforcement, mental health, and more. Each of these systems is a world unto itself, with its own professionals, its own attitudes, its own language. We've talked about how individual people develop their unique worldview. Well, the same thing happens with systems and organizations. They develop a dominant perspective. In the past, most of these perspectives have not included any significant understanding of development, stress, or trauma, or interrelated issues that can cause distress or trauma such as implicit bias, racism, and misogyny. But with so much new research emerging about these areas and these issues, it's become clear that our systems can't ignore them. And as each system has grappled with what trauma-informed means, they've used their own particular lens, their own view of the world. The result is that defining the term has been a challenge. Like the word trauma, it's been used by many different people and groups in many different ways. It may take some time to sort this out. The term trauma-informed care, or TIC, emerged back in 2001 to encourage mental health and child welfare systems to recognize that trauma was an important but misunderstood factor in the lives of the people these systems were serving. Over time, many groups started to use the term with minimal definition or clarity. Organizations would have a 3-hour seminar and declare themselves trauma-informed. Cities gave themselves the label. Even countries aspired to become the first trauma-informed nation. All of this was confusing. What constitutes a trauma-informed city anyway? Buzzwords abounded, but they were rarely connected to concrete implementation plans or changes in services, programs, or policy. TIC training became a cottage industry with hundreds of organizations and self-declared experts willing to take your money to ensure that you and your organization were, quote, trauma-informed. The quality of this training was, as you might expect, highly inconsistent. In response to this chaotic beginning, scores of countries, states, professional organizations, interdisciplinary committees, and professional teams worked to define and implement TIC. Unfortunately, these disjointed efforts further complicated things. As one committee concluded, despite years of work in the field, there is not a common definition of TIC. Dozens of versions of the crucial elements, principles, pillars, ingredients, assumptions, components, domains, and guidelines of trauma-informed care have emerged. But while there are some consistent concepts, the variability is head-spinning. The result is that you never know which version of trauma-informed care someone is thinking of when they use the term. This is why, when I'm talking about trauma practice programs or policy, I always try to describe the specific concepts, content, or objective, rather than use the term TIC or trauma-informed care. Having said all of this, I do think that these efforts are really important and that progress is being made. All of these organizations are teaching about trauma, advocating for increased public awareness, and supporting research to learn more. Many are evaluating and promoting promising interventions. In 1989, the National Center for PTSD was formed within the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, to study trauma and support veterans impacted by mostly combat-related trauma. In 2000, the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress was formed. It wasn't until 2018 that the branches of the CDC and SAMHSA dedicated to studying trauma came up with their 7 principles of trauma-informed care, which I suspect will continue to evolve as the field grows up. It's easy to forget how young traumatology, the study of trauma, is. And developmental traumatology as a discipline is even younger. Right now, organizations and systems are just starting to grapple with the very issues we've been discussing in this audiobook. And grapple they must, because trauma permeates all aspects of life. It echoes through the generations, across families, communities, institutions, cultures, and societies. And it does so in very complex ways. Trauma can impact our genes, white blood cells, heart, gut, lungs, and brain, our thinking, feeling, behaving, parenting, teaching, coaching, consuming, creating, prescribing, arresting, sentencing. I could go on. So, depending upon your perspective, your worldview, and your own history of trauma and loss, you will have some unique version of trauma-informed.
But in essence, it's approaching people with the awareness that what happened to you is important, that it influences your behavior and your health, and then using that awareness to act accordingly and respond appropriately, whether you're a parent, a teacher, a friend, therapist, doctor, police officer, judge.
Yes, that captures, as well as any other brief statement, the essence of trauma-informed. The act accordingly part is so important. It's one thing to be aware that trauma can result in certain behaviors and problems. It's another thing to ask, what do we do now? How do we create opportunities for healing within our system? How can we avoid repeating unpredictable, uncontrollable stressors that will exacerbate the effects of trauma? How do we make sure we don't re-traumatize someone by unintentionally continuing the marginalizing, dehumanizing experiences that gave rise to the very problems we're supposed to be addressing? I believe that if you don't recognize the built-in biases in yourself and the structural biases in your systems, biases regarding race, gender, sexual orientation, you can't truly be trauma-informed. Marginalized peoples, excluded, minimized, shamed, are traumatized peoples. Because, as we've discussed, humans are fundamentally relational creatures. To be excluded or dehumanized in an organization, community, or society you are part of results in prolonged, uncontrollable stress that is sensitizing. Marginalization is a fundamental trauma. This is why I believe that a truly trauma-informed system is an anti-racist system. The destructive effects of racial marginalization are pervasive and severe. In North America, Australia, and New Zealand, for instance, Black, brown, and indigenous children are more likely to be overdiagnosed and overmedicated in mental health systems, removed from their homes to enter the child welfare system, suspended or expelled from school, and charged at school with truancy and assault, with the result that they enter the juvenile justice system in disproportionate ways. As we've talked about, a child with traumatic experiences will often have difficulty learning and also be overreactive to the feedback and criticisms that come with struggling in school. This can lead to behavior problems. The behaviors are often misunderstood. So many of the things that people and systems do with good intentions actually cause additional pain for the families and children they're supposed to be serving.
This is something I want to discuss in a deeper way. During our 60 Minutes conversation, I realized that so many of the charities and nonprofits out there trying to fix social problems today are really only addressing the surface. They're attempting to build the community scaffolding we know is important, but many are missing the causes, the foundations of the problems they're trying to solve. If an after-school program doesn't understand why a child is experiencing chronic health problems or having trouble keeping up in school, if an employment program doesn't figure out why someone is having a hard time with supervisors or always explodes at people, then these programs will not succeed in creating lasting change. So walk us through how some of these issues actually develop and present themselves.
Well, let's start with young children. We've talked repeatedly about the important role of early life relationships in the development of the stress response systems and the capacity to form future healthy relationships. We know that when children experience distress and trauma, including poverty, homelessness, domestic violence, maltreatment, they will have some disruptions in development. Frequently, the result is a splintering of the maturation of specific skills, as we've talked about in Chapter 6, in relation to neglect. So a 5-year-old may have only developed the language skills of a typical 2-year-old and the self-regulation capabilities of a typical 4-year-old. Along with this fragmented development, the child will have an overactive and overly reactive stress response. Now envision this child entering a preschool environment with expectations, transitions, rules, and curricula designed for the typical 5-year-old. A developmentally uninformed, trauma-unaware setting will expect this child to act typical. But that is impossible for this child. The day will be filled with communication difficulties due to their language development, and intense frustration due to their self-regulation capabilities. In this overwhelmingly distressing situation, they will shut down or blow up. Either way, they don't get the full benefit of the social, emotional, or academic learning. They fall further behind. They may be kicked out. More children are expelled from school in pre-K than at any other grade level. Children of color, especially boys of color, are expelled at rates 3 times higher than white children. This is the start of a toxic mismatch between the child's capabilities and the unrealistic expectations of an education system that is all too often under-resourced, developmentally uninformed, and trauma-ignorant. Even if the child progresses to the next grade, they're still behind, and this sets them up to fail. Year after year, they fall further and further behind. Their delays in developing skills, together with their trauma-related symptoms, begin to attract mental health labels. The hypervigilance from their sensitized stress response is labeled ADHD. Their predictable efforts to self-regulate by rocking, chewing gum, doodling, daydreaming, listening to music, tapping their pencil, that's all prohibited. They will be labeled, medicated, excluded, punished, perhaps expelled, and then, all too often, arrested. When they try to avoid the constant humiliation of school, they're charged with truancy. When they try to flee and the school staff tries to stop them, a restraint incident results in charges of assault against the child. This is the school-to-prison pipeline.
And add to all this the fact that the student most likely has no idea that there's an underlying cause for their struggles. They end up adopting the world's view of them. They're dumb, slow, or lazy. It's a cycle of failure that chips away at their self-esteem until the student becomes so frustrated or ashamed that they give up.
This is such an important point. A child who is struggling is not going to say, "This poor teacher simply doesn't understand state-dependent functioning and the impact of trauma on my ability to learn. She should be helping me regulate, not conjugate." They say, "I must be dumb." The other really important point about schools is how many children and youth are experiencing learning and behavioral challenges related to trauma. This isn't just a few children. Studies show that between 30 and 50% of children in public schools have 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. And as we've discussed, these adversities have an impact. Imagine how many children are sitting in school with trauma-related memories that can be activated by innocent cues in the classroom. Remember that what we experience in the present moment is filtered by the lower parts of our brain before getting to the cortex. All incoming sensory information from the present moment is compared to and influenced by the memories of previous experiences, and is first processed in the lower, more reactive areas of the brain before reaching the rational thinking areas. Let's say an older child has grown up with episodic domestic violence. When he was younger, he saw his father belittling and hitting his mother. This happened at an important period of brain development when he was making primary memories to make sense of his world. His brain comes to associate attributes of men with threat. A loud, low, masculine voice is connected with fear. 5 years after these associations and memories were made, this young student has a male English teacher who happens to look a little like his abusive father. About the same height, same hair color, deep voice. The boy is not capable of consciously making the connection, but simply sitting in the classroom gives him a feeling of discomfort. This originates in those precortical lower parts of the brain. It's subconscious. Remember Sam, the boy whose father wore Old Spice? A person is rarely aware when they're activated by an evocative cue.
And since he's not aware of the association, how what happened to him affects his relationships, he may have a whole history of uncomfortable or sabotage relationships with the male figures in his life. They may be coaches or teachers or other men who could be positive role models for him, but he unconsciously avoids or rejects the opportunities.
Exactly. It's like when you weren't aware of why you were afraid to be alone at night. You weren't aware of the associations you'd made earlier in your life. Our behaviors begin to shape themselves around the emotional landmines left by previous trauma. But remember, the brain is always trying to make sense of the world, so this boy will struggle for an explanation. Maybe he decides he doesn't like English, or he starts to think that the teacher doesn't like him, that the teacher is a jerk. The teacher has no idea that any of this is happening. So let's say the student is struggling with a writing assignment. The teacher comes over with the intention of helping. He views his offer of help as a positive thing. As he bends to look at the work, his hand comes to rest on the boy's shoulder. But instead of being calmed, the boy recoils, reacting aggressively before even thinking. The lower brain immediately says danger, danger, and activates the stress response system, which immediately shuts down the cortex. So there's no chance for a reasoned, rational response. Later on, if you talked to the boy and said, "You shouldn't swear at a teacher," he'd say, "I know, it's not a good idea." But in the moment, he truly didn't have access to that ability to reason. The more you learn about trauma and stress response, the easier it is to understand certain behaviors you encounter in a workplace, in a relationship, or at school.
His brain, triggered by his past association with violence, sends a signal of threat, and he responds with fight or flight. Get your hands off me.
Maybe even get your effing hands off me. This aggressive, impulsive lashing out is completely baffling to the teacher. He doesn't understand what is really going on. When he describes the scene to others, he'll say something like, "For no reason at all, he just came at me." This is one of the most common descriptions of the behavioral outbursts related to evocative cues. Out of the blue, unpredictable. The behaviors seem unprovoked.
I just had another aha. So often we use the word snapped when we don't know where a burst of anger is coming from or why someone is having a violent reaction. Well, now we know something has happened in that moment that triggers one of the brain's trauma memories. And because the lower non-rational parts of the brain are its first responders, they immediately set off stress responses that then shut off the reasonable part of the brain. And so that burst of violence is actually the result of some highly organized processes in the brain. And in this case, the first thing the school is going to say is, "What's wrong with him?" The teacher, now convinced that something is wrong with that child, reports him to the principal's office, when what he should be asking is, what happened to this child?
That's right. This child will be viewed as a problem child. And if it continues, he will be sent to see the school counselor, then suspended, then referred to a mental health provider. And if no one in the mental health system understands his behavioral issues are related to what happened to him, related to his trauma, then they will also make a whole set of well-intended but ineffective interventions. If, on the other hand, this school had the resources and tools to help its teachers understand the prevalence of childhood adversities and the impact of trauma on learning, plus strategies to help create a regulated, safe, and secure classroom, the behavior would have been viewed quite differently. Rather than suspending and labeling the child, the school would try to create a process to connect with and understand him.
But that only starts if you ask the question, I wonder what happened to that child.
Exactly. If you change how you try to understand behaviors. The good news is that when schools do learn about the effects of trauma and make some simple changes in how they evaluate, support, and teach, they see dramatic improvements in academic achievement and decreases in challenging and disruptive behaviors. If the classroom uses regulatory strategies, the teachers are supported and respected, the needs and strengths of the children are identified and addressed, the outcomes are much better. We work with schools all over the world using our neurosequential model in education, NME, which teaches many of the core concepts you and I have been discussing. NME provides examples of classroom strategies to implement these principles and concepts. The results are very promising. Teachers, administrators, parents, and children all report positive effects, and the outcomes support these views. Many other groups are introducing trauma-informed programs into schools as well. As with the definition of trauma-informed care, the elements of these different models and programs vary tremendously. But all of the successful models have one thing in common. They emphasize regulation and connection.
So helping children regulate is a key what to do in a trauma-aware school. Regulate, relate, then reason, yes? Appreciating the sequence of engagement is essential.
Yes. Unfortunately, our schools are typically not trauma-aware and tend to prohibit many of the regulatory activities we've mentioned. Walking, rocking, fiddling with things while listening to a lesson, listening to music with your earbuds while you're doing homework. Somatosensory regulation, such as the rhythmic activities we have discussed, actually opens up the cortex and makes the reasoning parts of the brain more accessible for learning. Schools also tend to minimize powerful healing and resilience-building activities like sports, music, and art. These are often viewed as elective or enrichment activities, when in fact they can be the very bedrock of academic learning, thanks to their regulatory and relational elements. Pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity makes the overactive and overly reactive core regulatory networks get back in balance. Music falls into this category, both playing and listening. All sports involve doses of it, dance too, and of course, each of these activities also has very important relational elements. You learn when you pass the ball to your teammate. You learn how to move with your dance partner. You synchronize playing your violin with other members of the orchestra. Finally, there are cognitive elements to sports, music, and other arts. They engage, activate, and synchronize activity throughout the brain, from the bottom up and from the top down. These are whole brain, healthy activities. Now imagine 30 children sitting in rows in a classroom, passively listening to a teacher lecture. This is not an efficient way to engage the top part of the brain. We learn faster when we're moving and interacting with others. We store new information and retrieve previously stored information most efficiently when engaged in some form of somatosensory activation during learning.
After the student blows up and the school sends them to a mental health service, what happens if that organization has no training or experience with trauma?
Well, nothing good. It usually makes the child's situation worse. They are mislabeled and, typically, over-medicated. Our current child mental health systems are under-resourced and overwhelmed. It's not uncommon for public mental health clinics to have long waiting lists. Sometimes appointments take place only once a month. Sometimes a visit with a psychiatrist lasts only 15 minutes. The average number of visits before the family simply stops coming is about 3. Our mental health systems tend to be crisis-focused. With that said, there are many places where clinical teams have learned about trauma and are doing really nice work. In the ideal situation, the child will get an assessment that looks at their developmental history. Basically, a detailed evaluation of what happened to you. A good assessment will also determine the child's needs and strengths. Based upon these, the team can create an individual treatment approach that will take advantage of the child's strengths and target the area of need with appropriate enrichment, educational, or therapeutic activities. These teams know that any one-size-fits-all solution does not work. Think about how absurd it would be if everyone who had chest pain and a cough got the exact same antibiotic. That is what happens in many clinics that specialize in a specific technique. At a clinic that has learned that trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT, is an evidence-based intervention for trauma, everyone with trauma may get this intervention. But while it is helpful for some, it isn't for all. A truly trauma-aware clinical team has a lot of tools to use. Occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech and language supports, liaisons with the school, good psychoeducation with the family and child, plus access to a range of therapeutic techniques, such as TFCBT, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, somatosensory interventions, animal-assisted therapies, and many more. Despite being a young field, traumatology does have preliminary evidence of the effectiveness of many of these techniques when used at the right time in the treatment process. What that means is that an effective therapeutic approach has to follow the sequence of engagement. Problems with regulating have to be addressed before you can get results with relational or cognitive therapies. This is why I developed the neurosequential model of therapeutics, the NMT, that I wrote about in my first book with Maya Salovitz, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. For me, one of the most important aspects of healing is recognizing that it can involve multiple therapeutic techniques and approaches. What we know is that the key ingredient of effective healing involves using your healthy relationships to revisit and rework the traumatic experience. If you have a therapist and form a safe and stable connection, the therapist becomes a critical part of what I call your therapeutic web. But remember that therapeutic moments can be brief and ideally are spread throughout your whole week. It's not just about 1 hour a week with the therapist. This process creates opportunities to activate trauma memories, including the stress response systems, in a moderate, predictable, and controllable way. In turn, this will take the sensitized systems and, over time, make them more neurotypical.
What if you don't have the resources to get a therapist?
That's a great question. Most people who experience adversity and trauma do not have access to therapy, let alone a clinical team like I just described. But what we're learning is that having access to a number of invested, caring people is actually a better predictor of good outcomes following trauma than having access to a therapist. The therapeutic web is the collection of positive, relational-based opportunities you have throughout your day. A therapist can be an important part of healing, but isn't required. This isn't to suggest that therapy isn't helpful, but therapy without connectedness is not very effective. Ideally, a child can have connectedness to family, community, and culture, along with a trauma-aware clinical team and its range of tools. But again, if you look at indigenous and traditional healing practices, they do a remarkable job of creating a total mind-body experience that influences multiple brain systems. Remember, trauma memories span multiple brain areas. So these traditional practices will have cognitive, relational-based, and sensory elements. You retell the story, create images of the battle, hunt, death, hold each other, massage, dance, sing. You reconnect to loved ones, to community. You celebrate, eat, and share. Aboriginal healing practices are repetitive, rhythmic, relevant, relational, respectful, and rewarding. Experiences known to be effective in altering neural systems involved in the stress response. The practices emerged because they worked. People felt better and functioned better, and the core elements of the healing process were reinforced and passed on. Cultures separated by time and space converged on the same principles for healing.
When you think about it, that really is remarkable.
It is. Our ancestors recognized the importance of connectedness and the toxicity of exclusion. The history of the civilized world, on the other hand, is filled with policies and practices that favor disconnection and marginalization, that destroy family, community, and culture. Colonization, slavery, the U.S. reservation system, Canada's residential schools, Australia's stolen generation. These were so destructive across so many generations because they intentionally destroyed the family and cultural bonds that keep a people connected. They created disconnected, traumatized individuals in inescapable, painful situations. Situations that, as we've discussed, make people dissociate in order to adapt and survive. And even though the dissociation is adaptive, it results in more passivity and compliance, making traumatized peoples easier to dehumanize and exploit. While less obvious to some, I believe that our existing child welfare, educational, mental health, and juvenile justice systems often do the same thing. They fragment families, undermine community, and engage in marginalizing, shaming, and punitive practices.
You spoke so movingly about systemic racism, dismantled power, and trauma when you joined me in South Africa once to visit my school. We built the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls in 2007, and 13 years after the formal end of apartheid and the creation of a democratic South African government. Now, when you visited, we were struggling to create a healthy sense of community among the faculty. The black teachers felt that the white teachers expressed a level of superiority, even though they were accepting of them. And you provided so much clarity when you explain what might be going on between the two groups, using the lens of brain development and its connection to implicit bias and racism. Can you do that here?
Well, I'll try. We've talked about how an infant's brain takes in sensory information to make sense of their world and build associations. And we've talked about how we're deeply relational creatures whose developing brains, starting with the lowest areas, begin to make memories of the smells, sounds, and images of our people. These memories exist on a very deep precortical unconscious level. The way your people talk, the way they dress, the color of their skin. Now remember that your brain is always monitoring your world, both inside and outside, to ensure your survival. And when the brain encounters any unfamiliar experience, its default move is to activate the stress response. Better to be safe than sorry. Better to assume that novelty can be a potential threat. Now add to this the fact that the major predator of humans has always been other humans. Our stress response has evolved to be relationally sensitive, such that when we're with people who have attributes similar to our childhood clan, we feel safe. But when we encounter people with attributes that are different from our people, the brain's default is to activate the stress response. When that happens, we feel dysregulated, even threatened.
This is why, if you have a new baby and everyone wants to see the baby and is passing the baby around, sometimes the baby will start crying. Their brain is reacting to the unfamiliar.
Absolutely. To the infant, all these people are different, new, and overwhelming. That activates the stress response. But adult brains also activate the stress response in reaction to people who are different from their original clan. Now, most of the time this activation is mild, creating a wariness, caution. But if someone has a sensitized stress response, or the attributes of the new person are very different from your clan, a more dramatic stress activation can take place. And when that happens, we regress. We lose access to the higher part of our brain, the part that stores our values and beliefs. Our thinking and behavior start to be driven by more primitive, reactive parts of our brain. Let me give you an example. I once met a woman whose daughter joined the Peace Corps and was going from village to village in a very rural area of Africa, giving children immunizations. She was from Minnesota and very Scandinavian looking, tall, blonde, pale white skin.
And she'd go into villages where people had literally never seen a white person.
Yes. So here is this very positive, big-hearted young woman who loves children and feels like she's making the world a better place, enthusiastically going into rural villages to combat disease. But when she'd walk into a village, the young children would take one look at her and scream. They thought she was a ghost. Some of them would start crying, some of them would run away. This was hard for the young woman to get used to. And it wasn't until her mother told her about some of our work that she finally understood that these children were reacting to the unknown and not to her personally. Their brains had not created any positive association to whiteness. So encountering her was very unexpected and stress activating. But that's only the initial response. Over time, the young woman is loving to them, nurtures them, takes care of them. She feeds them and regulates them when they're scared. So the children learn that this white person who's giving them love and nurturing and support is safe and good. And that learning gets locked into their brain to the point that if they have an encounter years later with another white person, their default will be to categorize the new white person as positive.
Even if the new white person is not so nice, it won't necessarily undo the original template of the nice white lady from Minnesota, because that template was built more deeply into their brain at a young age.
That's right. The first time you encounter someone with characteristics such as skin color that are unlike your people, you begin to create new associations to help you make sense of your world, because your world now includes a new person. Your brain will sort, compare, and categorize this person. In the beginning, it will use your existing defaults. This is a person with male attributes. This is a person older than I am. This is a person who is a teacher. But the more times you're with this person, the more chances you have to build new, more nuanced associations. You get to know the facets and complexities of the person and not simply their categories. At the same time, though, the brain is always using shortcuts, and these shortcuts are not always accurate. They make us vulnerable to stereotypes and isms, generalizing attributes of people based upon the broad categories they fall into. And the most powerful categories in our brain come from our first experiences, usually in early life. This contributes to our tendencies for bias. A while back when I was working with a young black child, I asked him if he'd ever met a white man. One, he said. Turned out that the first white person this boy really saw up close, not on television, was a police officer who pulled his dad over, aimed his gun at his dad, made his dad get out of the car, yelled at his dad, handcuffed him, and then threw his dad into the squad car. The boy was left sitting in the car, terrified, until a social worker showed up and took him away. They didn't even let his mother see him until she had proven who she was. You can imagine that the boy's internal representation of white people was very different from the village children's after they were nurtured by the white Peace Corps volunteer. Now, this same child, the one who watched his father being violently arrested, later comes to see me, a white doctor who's trying to help him. Our relationship doesn't start from a neutral place. He feels fearful, distrusting of me, in part because I'm new to him, in part because I'm white. It takes weeks and weeks of gentle, patient, positive work before he can view me as neutral. We did end up connecting in good ways, but I was viewed as an exception. His original negative experiences with whiteness, reinforced by many related experiences of overt and implicit racism at school and in the community, stayed with him. The earliest relational experiences are the most powerful and enduring. Because of the sequential processing of experience, this boy will always process whiteness in the lower part of his brain first. When he encounters a new white man, his original and therefore default association of white men and threat will cause a stress activation that can influence how he feels, thinks, and behaves. It's like an evocative cue. The boy's brain has already activated his fear response by the time any other information about the new white man can get to his cortex. In his cortex, he does have some autobiographical memory from seeing me, some stored information that Dr. Perry is white, but he was okay. But in the moment, with an activated fear response, he cannot efficiently access that information. He will look at this new white man and feel, but this isn't Dr. Perry. Our first experiences create the filters through which all new experiences must pass. In the case of South Africa, there are many, many cultures in one country. And for generations, the white community brutally oppressed people of color. The black teachers at Auleg had grown up in a world where active resistance to white power and the country's racist policies, practices, and laws could lead to death. Associations related to whiteness were often fear-inducing. Many black people developed an adaptive strategy and style that was fundamentally dissociative. Avoid conflict. When confronted, comply. Adaptive capabilities like these are deeply ingrained.
And so many of the teachers in the school may have unconsciously been holding on to those old ways of thinking and behaving.
Exactly. In 1994, when the oppressive practices of apartheid ended, people's brains didn't immediately change. White people were still associated with dominance and marginalization. Even though things had theoretically changed, when people who were raised in apartheid interacted with each other, there was an unconscious reestablishing of power differentials and an eliciting of old patterns of adaptation. The white teachers felt comfortable speaking up and leading. The black teachers sat back, avoiding conflict, and complied with suggestions they didn't necessarily support. This led to big problems at the school. And yet when I talked to the white teachers, they would sincerely say that racism was not playing a role in the issues at the school. One of the hardest things to grasp about implicit bias and racism is that your beliefs and values do not always drive your behavior. These beliefs and values are stored in the highest, most complex part of your brain, the cortex. But other parts of your brain can also make associations, distorted, inaccurate, racist associations. The same person can have very sincere anti-racist beliefs, but still have implicit biases that result in racist comments or actions. Understanding sequential processing in the brain is essential to grasping this, as is appreciating the power of developmental experiences to load the lower parts of our brain with all kinds of associations that create our worldview.
We hear so many white people say, nobody ever used the N-word in my house. But it's not just a matter of language. It's how you see your parents treat people who are not like you. It's how you see them in their interactions with other people. It's what is said about them. It's the emotional tone that comes through in your household about people who are other. That is what you're taking in from the time you're born. So it shapes how you see people who aren't like you. Whether somebody used the N-word or didn't use the N-word isn't the point. There are a lot more influences at work.
Many more. When you're young and you're forming your primary associations about how the world works, your major influences come from your parents. And not really what they say, but how they act. You're also influenced by the other children and adults around you. If you're a white child who spends no time with children of color, you don't have any personal experiences to help build those important relational associations. We're also profoundly influenced by the media. From infancy, the media images we see shape our understanding of the world. For many white people, their only experience or perception of people of color is through the media. When I was growing up, the media was permeated with negative stereotypes about black people.
I know lots of white people who, until they met me, had never known a black person. And there was a time when some white people actually had black people working for them so they could say they knew one. But as you say, for many white people, their only association with black people was what they saw on the news or in the movies.
And when I was young, black men and black youth in movies or on TV were much more likely to be portrayed in a negative way, as a criminal, for example. They weren't the detectives, superheroes, scientists. This distortion has an incredibly powerful impact on the way your brain organizes. It contributes to the negative associations white people create about people of color. It is a big part of creating implicit bias. We all create our own version of the world that has distortions. As I said, the brain's shortcuts in processing information make us vulnerable to bias. Everybody has some form of implicit bias, some distortion of the world that's based on how and where they grew up. Imagine the odds of having every single culture and every single religion and every single ethnicity become part of your safe and familiar catalog, let alone being exposed to all that in the first few years of life. And so we need to acknowledge that we all carry some of these things around.
In Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, which everybody should read, may I say, she quotes a study from a criminal justice reform organization called the Sentencing Project. They found that crimes involving a black suspect and a white victim make up only 10% of all crimes. They account for 42% of what's reported on television. When you're watching the news and almost half of what you see is black people committing crimes against white people, that's going to influence the way you think when you see a black person.
Absolutely. Let's take a moment to think of how that implicit bias plays a role in an interaction between an inexperienced white cop in a confrontation with a black teenager late at night. It's a matter of state-dependent functioning. Under threat, the reasoning part of the brain starts to shut down, and the more reactive emotional parts of the brain take over. Say you're the white cop and you feel threatened and you have a gun. If the lower, more reactive parts of your brain start to dominate your cognitions and behaviors when you feel under threat, and your brain has a whole catalog of black men as threatening criminals, you are much more likely to engage in fear-based behavior, yelling, escalating, pulling a trigger with a black teen than with a white teen. Your brain isn't filled with a catalog of threatening white teens. Talk about a system that needs trauma training. Law enforcement should be at the top of the list. Training about trauma, the brain, stress, and distress is essential if you're going to be a first responder, especially a police officer. Anyone given the responsibility of carrying a gun in service of society should have extensive training in these things.
But there is a difference between implicit bias and racism. Where do you see that line?
Well, implicit bias suggests that the bias is present but not plainly expressed, sometimes even unintentionally expressed. Racism, on the other hand, is an actual overt set of beliefs about the superiority of one race over others. In the U.S., racism is the marginalization and oppression of people of color by systems created by white men to privilege white people. You could say that racism is embedded in the top, rational part of your brain, whereas implicit bias involves the distorting filters created in the lower parts of the brain. When a child or youth is exposed to overt racist beliefs, possibly in their home or peer groups, those beliefs can become embedded in the filters. The result can be a deeply ingrained set of feelings and beliefs that cut across multiple regions of the brain.
Change, however, is possible. I think it's important to bring up a conversation I had in 2018 that confirmed my belief that through compassion, there's hope for even the most racist individual to evolve. I spoke with a man named Anthony Ray Hinton, who spent 30 years on death row in Alabama for a crime he did not commit. The prison setup was extremely isolating, just him alone in his cell, unable to see any of the other inmates on the row with him. No one ever really talked to each other, but at night you could hear crying and moaning, men in pain. And one night, Mr. Hinton heard someone crying, and something inside him shifted. He called out, "Hey, what's wrong?" And the man told him that his mother had died. Now, Mr. Hinton was extremely close to his own mother, and in that moment, he empathized. And that one question, that act of compassion, opened the door for all the men on death row. They began talking to each other regularly, sharing stories, giving each other support. Mr. Hinton became particularly friendly with a man named Henry, and he eventually learned that his friend Henry was Henry Hayes, a member of the Ku Klux Klan who'd been imprisoned for hanging a young black boy. But instead of cutting him off and ending that friendship, Mr. Hinton formed a bond with him on death row, and they remained close friends.
And I would bet by doing that, Anthony was able to also change Henry.
So much so that on the night that Henry was electrocuted, his last words were that all of his life he'd gotten it wrong. His parents had taught him wrong, that black people were the enemy, and he'd come to death row to learn what love was.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful. And a perfect example of how even the most hateful racist belief system can be changed. Remember that the cortex is the most malleable, the most changeable part of the brain. Beliefs and values can change.
Implicit bias is trickier to change, right?
Implicit bias is much more difficult. You may truly believe that racism is bad, that all people are equal, but those beliefs are in the intellectual part of your brain, and your implicit biases, which are in the lower part of your brain, will still play out every day. In the way you interact with others, the jokes you laugh at, the things you say. It is interesting to watch how this relates to the Black Lives Matter movement. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, so many conversations have been sparked about structural racism, implicit bias, and white privilege. This has illuminated so much misunderstanding and resulted in so much expressed pain. And of course, so much defensiveness. I've never been racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body. Well, the issue isn't your bones. It's your brain. All of us have deeply ingrained biases, and lurking among these are racist associations. The challenge of addressing implicit bias is first recognizing that you have it. Reflect on when your biases have been expressed. Anticipate when and where you may be likely to express your bias. Be courageous enough to spend time with people who are different from you and who may challenge your biases. It can be uncomfortable. But remember, moderate, predictable, controllable stress can build resilience, create new associations, have new experiences. Ideally, you go out into the community and spend time with people who are different than you are. You need to create real, meaningful relationships so that you get to know individuals based on their unique qualities, not based on categories.
That's what really changes both implicit bias and racism.
Exactly. And this is why you can't be in a corporation and address these issues by simply having everyone go to an anti-racism course or cultural sensitivity training. You don't get trained in cultural sensitivity. You go spend time immersed in the culture. Spend time with other people. Anthony Bourdain was a great example of this. He encouraged people to experience other cultures by spending time with the cooks, preparing the meals, eating the food, celebrating cultural events with the people who celebrate them. You can't become culturally sensitive from a 3-hour seminar.
Does that mean that we shouldn't have cultural sensitivity training?
No, it means that cultural sensitivity training, which may help get at the intellectual elements of learning, needs to be coupled with real experiences and real relationships. That is what will really help change you. It's hard for many people to do, and it certainly doesn't fix the whole system, but it's a start. The long-term solution is to minimize the development of implicit bias. We have to think about ways to raise our children with more opportunities to be exposed to the magnificence of human diversity earlier in their lives. And we have to change the inherently biased elements of so many of our systems.
Do you think that trauma is causing humanity to move backward?
Well, no. As we discussed earlier, human beings have always lived with a lot of trauma. I think the humanity of our species ebbs and flows. There have been times of tremendous humanity and times of terrible inhumanity. But if you look at the history of humankind, all the major indicators related to health and welfare, social justice, creativity, and productivity are trending up right now. This isn't to say that now isn't an incredibly hard time in the United States. There is a lot of polarization. There are a lot of people using fear to shape public opinion. Angry, polarized groups don't listen well, but they are communicating fear and pain and hunger for change. I'm hopeful that by teaching about trauma and the power of connectedness, things will improve. We could invest in building neighborhoods, building trauma-informed services, supporting artists, rebuilding the infrastructure, building spaces where people would create community. We could have a quantum leap in humanity. We could. We can. But first, we need to understand the pervasive and complex effects of trauma. We have so much unexpressed potential.